Chapter 3. Divine Authority for the Change Lacking. Jesus Christ did not change the Sabbath. As Creator, He had brought it into existence. He designed it to be a memorial of His power in the work of both creation and redemption. When He came into the world to carry out the eternal purpose of human salvation, it is scarcely conceivable that He would set aside the memorial which He Himself had established to commemorate His finished work of redemption. Neither the disciples of Christ nor the early Christian churches ever heard of such a thing as a divine change in Sabbath observance. Hence the observance of any other day than the seventh as the Sabbath is unknown in the New Testament. Sunday observance by Christian believers is of later origin than the times of the Bible. Indeed, no insignificant part of the public teaching and work of Christ will be found to have been given to setting forth what it is lawful and right to do on the seventh day, which is rather difficult of explanation by those who profess to believe He abolished the Sabbath. The observance of the Sabbath by the Jewish people in the time of Christ had come to be entirely unlike that which God designed it to be. So far from being a blessing, it had come to be a burden. Satan had done his best by seductive temptations to cause the Jews to relinquish the observance of the Sabbath. In this he was partially successful. God permitted His people to go into the Babylonian captivity because of their sins, which included Sabbath breaking. Upon their return from the captivity, the Jews resolved to keep the Sabbath with the utmost faithfulness, as God had commanded. But again the evil one determined to ensnare them, and succeeded in leading them to pervert both the meaning and the purpose of the Sabbath, until it was loaded with burdensome restrictions. When Jesus appeared as a public teacher among the Jews, He missed no opportunity to correct the false conceptions of the Sabbath. He seized upon every occasion to free the day from its burdensome, man-made regulations. Miracles on the Sabbath. Indeed, He made such occasions, for He purposely selected the Sabbath as the day on which to do many of His miracles and works of mercy. In Capernaum, in the synagogue and on the Sabbath day, He cast the spirit of an unclean devil out of the man whom it had bound. Later, on the same Sabbath, He healed Simon's wife's mother of a great fever. See Luke 4:30-39. Such acts performed on the Sabbath were looked upon with serious question by the Jews, for they would not bring Him their sick upon the Sabbath, but waited until even, when the sun did set. See Mark 1:32-34, Luke 4:40. Jesus, however, continued to correct their views regarding what constituted real Sabbath keeping, and to bring about a reform in the observance of the Sabbath. In order to convince them that He spoke with authority in the matter, He took occasion, in connection with the incident of His disciples plucking the ears of corn on the Sabbath, to declare that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. See Matthew 12:1-8. In this same connection He gave helpful instruction regarding the nature of true Sabbath keeping. Christ risked His life to free the Sabbath. So necessary was it to free the Sabbath from the wicked traditions surrounding it, which went so far as to prevent the doing of anything on that day toward the healing of the sick, that Christ braved the malice of the Pharisees and risked His life in order to free the Sabbath from these perverted restrictions. When He healed the man with the withered hand in the synagogue upon the Sabbath, and in connection therewith gave much needed instruction as to the proper observance of the day, the Pharisees, in anger, held a council against Him, how they might destroy Him. See Matthew 12:9-14. He healed the impotent man at the pool of Bethesda, healed him of an infirmity of 38 years standing. When this was complained of, and the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to slay Him, He once more seized the occasion to give them sound instruction regarding Sabbath observance, saying, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." See John 5:1-19. Months later this same case of healing was brought under discussion, and He again enlightened His enemies regarding the meaning of the Sabbath. See John 7:21-23. Christ cleared the Sabbath of the burdensome restrictions placed on it by the Jews. He healed the sick on the sacred day, bringing relief to the suffering. Rescuing the Sabbath from burdensome restrictions. The Jews refused, however, to receive instruction, and the Lord found it necessary to continue His work in behalf of the Sabbath, the work of rescuing it from the perversions that concealed from the multitude its true purpose and prevented many from finding in it spiritual blessing and rest. On the Sabbath he met a man who was born blind, and in compassion moistened clay, anointed the blind eyes, and sent the man to a pool to Washington. The man went, washed, and received his sight. This making of the clay and healing of the blind was looked upon as a violation of the Sabbath by his bigoted enemies, whereas it was the perfection of Sabbath keeping. See John 9, 138. Later, on another Sabbath, he healed a woman who had been bound by Satan 18 years, and could not stand erect. He met the clamor of his opponents by giving further instruction regarding genuine Sabbath keeping, silencing them and bringing gladness to the people. See Luke 13, 10-17. He gave additional instruction on the proper observance of the Sabbath at a Sabbath dinner in a Pharisee's house, during which he healed the man afflicted with dropsy. See Luke 14, 1-6. So the history of the ministry of Christ reveals him as a true Sabbath keeper. He put forth sustained effort to correct long-established errors regarding the Sabbath, endeavoring to free it of the rigors and burdens of Pharisaic tradition. Certainly, in the face of such a record, it is folly to maintain that the Lord of the Sabbath intended to do away with the observance of the seventh day. Had such been his purpose, he would not have devoted so much of his public ministry to the work of instructing the people how rightly to keep this day. It is most unfair, to put it mildly, for Christian teachers today, in order to carry out their purpose of turning the minds of men against the Sabbath of the Bible, to represent these man-made restrictions and Pharisaic rigors as really belonging to the Sabbath of God, and thus construe Christ's long-continued and powerful effort to rid the Sabbath of these perversions as a proof of his violation of God's Sabbath commandment and as an effort to discredit the Sabbath itself. Those who do this, in reality take their stand against the Lord of the Sabbath, and join the ancient Pharisees in saying, "This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day." John 9, 16. First day mentioned 6 times in the Gospels. The 4 Gospels mention the first day of the week 6 times, and in these texts those who observe the first day must find their warrant for such observance. The passages in the Gospels which refer to the first day are Matthew 28, 1, Mark 16, 1, 2, 9, Luke 23, 56 and 24, 1, John 20, 1, 19. Here, if anywhere, must be sought whatever authority there is for Sunday sacredness. These texts speak of the first day of the week. They unite in declaring that the resurrection of our Lord took place on that day. Sunday observers claim that the occurrence of this event on that day brought about a change of the Sabbath from the 7th day to the 1st. If this is so, these passages should make it clear. But an examination of these passages reveals that they say nothing whatever about a change of the Sabbath. They speak of the Sabbath, it is true, but they most carefully discriminate between the Sabbath and the first day of the week, making it plain that the Sabbath of the New Testament is the day before the first day. They give no sacred title to the first day. They do give such a title to the 7th day. They do not say that Christ rested on the first day, which would have been essential to its becoming a Sabbath. They say nothing about any blessing being placed upon the first day. They do not tell us that Christ ever said anything about the first day, either as a holy day or otherwise. They give no precept or command regarding its observance. There is nothing in these passages declaring that the first day is to be looked upon by the followers of Christ as anything more than the ordinary weekday that it is called, just the first day of the week. No authority for Sunday sacredness. After giving full consideration to all these passages, Smith's Dictionary of the Bible, in its article on the Lord's Day, makes this admission. Taken separately, perhaps, and even altogether, these passages seem scarcely adequate to prove that the dedication of the first day of the week to the purposes above mentioned was a matter of apostolic institution, or even of apostolic practice. Page 356. Hence there is no evidence in these passages to cause any follower of our Lord to believe that they contain any authority at all for Sunday sacredness. Instead of its being true that Jesus blessed and hallowed the first day, the fact is that he never once mentioned the first day. He did not even take its name upon his lips, so far as we have any record. First day mentioned once in the Acts. The first day of the week is mentioned in but 2 other places in the New Testament. The first of these is in the book of Acts, Upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. And there were many lights in the upper chamber, where they were gathered together. Acts 20:7-8. Here is the record of a religious meeting that was held on the first day of the week. In passing, it should be noticed that this is the only instance recorded in the New Testament where a religious meeting was held on the first day. This passage, however, contains no evidence of a change of the Sabbath, and no support for Sunday sacredness. It was a first-day meeting, but not a Sunday meeting. It was held at night. There were many lights, and Paul continued his speech until midnight. The only night there is to the Bible first day is what we now know as Saturday night. Bible days begin and end at sunset. The Bible first day begins at sunset Saturday night and is over at sunset Sunday night. The midnight, therefore, to which Paul continued his speech must have been, could only have been, Saturday night. Knieber and Howson, in their deservedly popular life and epistles of the Apostle Paul, dealing with the time when this meeting was held, make these remarks. It was the evening which succeeded the Jewish Sabbath. On the Sunday morning the vessel was about to sail. Scribner's Ed., Volume 2, p. 206. Dr. Horatio B. Hackett, professor of New Testament Greek in Rochester Theological Seminary, in his commentary on Acts, says, "The Jews reckoned the day from evening to morning, and on that principle the evening of the first day of the week would be our Saturday evening. If Luke reckoned so here, as many commentators suppose, the apostle then waited for the expiration of the Jewish Sabbath, and held his last religious service with the brethren at Troas, on Saturday evening, and consequently resumed his journey on Sunday morning." Edition of 1882, pages 221, 222. The account in Acts telling of this night meeting was written by Luke 30 years, at least, after the crucifixion of Christ. It is significant that in referring to the first day he does not call it by a sacred title or name. He says nothing about its supposedly sacred character. He speaks of it merely as one of the weekdays, the first of the 7. There is no support for Sunday sacredness in this passage. The final mention of the first day. The final mention of the first day of the week in the Bible is in the writings of Paul, the only time the writer of these epistles, or any of the epistles of the New Testament, refers to the day in any connection. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. 1 Corinthians 16, 1, 2. It is argued from this passage that the first day must have been the day for public worship in the churches of Corinth and Galatia, and if in these, then most probably in the other apostolic churches as well, and that therefore the Sabbath had been changed to that day. This, however, is getting out of the text far more than it even remotely implies. No Sunday meeting. This passage arranges for precisely the reverse of a public collection. Each believer in Corinth was to lay by himself in store as God had prospered him, not take his offering to a place of meeting, not hold any meeting at all on that day for public worship. The Greek lexicon of Greenfield translates the Greek here, with oneself, that is, at home. Sir William Domville, in his book The Sabbath, has these comments on the claims that are sometimes made regarding the significance of this passage. Strange that a text which says nothing of any meeting for any purpose, should be brought to prove a custom to meet for purposes of religion. If it be strange to infer from it a custom to meet, although no meeting is mentioned in it, it seems still more strange, still more inconsistent, to infer from it, that a direction to lay by alms at home means that those alms should be given at church. The translation in our common Bibles is just to the original, "Let every one of you lay by him in store." A still more literal translation of the word in the original, "Thesaurzen," treasuring up, would render it still more apparent that each contributor was to make the accumulation himself, and not to hand it over from week to week to any other person. Pages 101-104. There is nothing in this passage to show that the early churches were observing Sunday as the Sabbath. The first day is mentioned, indeed, but merely as one of the days of the week, the day on which, after they had observed the Sabbath and had returned to their weekly toil and started a new week of business, they were to cast up accounts, determine the gains of the preceding week, and, learning how God had prospered them, lay aside a proportion of their gains for the famine-stricken brethren elsewhere. Ceremonial Sabbaths discontinued. It is supposed by some that Paul had reference to the change of the Sabbath when he wrote to the Colossians, "Let no man therefore judge you in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ." Colossians 2:16, 17. The ceremonial system of the Old Testament had many festivals, holy days, annual Sabbaths. That system, imposed on them until the time of Reformation, Hebrews 9:10, had passed away with Christ, whom it had foreshadowed. The believer in Christ was not, therefore, to return to its types and shadows. He did not need to observe its 7 annual Sabbaths, Leviticus 23:4, 24, 32, 39, all of which were to be kept in addition to or beside the Sabbaths of the Lord, Leviticus 23:38. And as these ceremonial and ritual observances were no longer binding, the Christian believer is, in this passage in Colossians, exhorted not to permit any man to judge him in these things. This passage has no reference at all to the seventh-day Sabbath of the Lord. Perhaps this will be received more readily, and be seen more clearly, if attention is called to the comment on this passage by noted authorities. Dr. Adam Clarke, in the commentary that bears his name, says concerning Colossians 2:16. There is no intimation here that the Sabbath was done away, or that its moral use was superseded by the introduction of Christianity. I have shown elsewhere that, remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, is a command of perpetual obligation, and can never be superseded but by the final termination of time. As it is a type of that rest which remains for the people of God, of an eternity of bliss, it must continue in full force till that eternity arrives, for no type ever ceases till the antitype be come. Besides, it is not clear that the Apostle refers at all to the Sabbath in this place, whether Jewish or Christian. His Sabbaton, of Sabbaths or weeks, most probably refers to their feasts of weeks, of which much has been said in the notes on the Pentateuch. Edition of 1851. Dr. Albert Barnes, the well-known Presbyterian commentator, in his notes on Colossians 2:16, writes thus: "Or of the Sabbath days." The word Sabbath in the Old Testament is applied not only to the seventh day, but to all the days of holy rest that were observed by the Hebrews, and particularly to the beginning and close of their great festivals. There is, doubtless, reference to those days in this place, as the word is used in the plural number, and the Apostle does not refer particularly to the Sabbath properly so called. There is no evidence from this passage that he would teach that there was no obligation to observe any holy time, for there is not the slightest reason to believe that he meant to teach that one of the 10 Commandments had ceased to be binding on mankind. If he had used the word in the singular number, the Sabbath, it would then, of course, have been clear that he meant to teach that that commandment had ceased to be binding, and that a Sabbath was no longer to be observed. But the use of the term in the plural number, and the connection, show that he had his eye on the great number of days which were observed by the Hebrews as festivals, as a part of their ceremonial and typical law, and not to the moral law, or the 10 Commandments. No part of the moral law, no one of the 10 Commandments, could be spoken of as a shadow of good things to come. These commandments are, from the nature of moral law, of perpetual and universal obligation. Edition of 1850, pp. 306, 307. We conclude, therefore, after careful examination of the New Testament, that it contains no evidence of a change of the Sabbath, no divine authority for such a change, and no support in even the smallest degree for Sunday observance. Unholy hands have, in effect, chiseled the Sabbath command from the law by substituting another day for the one set apart by God.